In November, the 26th COP will happen, and you need to know what Australia is bringing to the table. Welcome to Good Cop, Bad Cop, where we explain what the go is with the big UN climate conference. In the last episode, we went through the ins and outs and the history. In this episode, we dive into what Australia's contribution will be. Spoiler, it falls far short of what is credible.
Richie and Alia have already set the scene for you. This episode, we're going to talk about exactly what Australia is bringing to the table in November. And this is going to help you understand what's really going on when you hear the government bigging itself up in the media in the lead up to COP. Because I guarantee you that's what it's going to be doing. We're going to look at our target, i.e. what is it? Is it sufficient enough? And we'll look at the mechanisms and policies that the government is saying is going to get us to that target. What is it? And are they credible? Are they sufficient? We're going to show you, more importantly, that while we've got no ambition and no intention of reducing emissions, that we're actually really, really good at pretending we're doing things. We put so much effort into pretending that we're taking action on climate. So here's an analogy. Let's look at the COP like one big family dinner, and the UN is the parents or the guardians, and all the countries are the kids sitting around the table. And the parents are saying, right, everyone's got to eat their dinner, everyone's got to eat their veggies if you want dessert. And some countries like Sweden are doing the right thing, and they're going, yeah, we got to all eat a healthy dinner if we want to be healthy. We'll eat our veggies, and they're hooking into the broccoli and the cauliflower. And Australia is basically doing everything it can to avoid eating its veggies. It's arguing, it's negotiating, it's saying, you know what, I'll eat 2 bits of broccoli and that's it. It's pointing at China and saying, well, what's China doing? They're not eating their vegetables. It's hiding vegetables under the plate. It's doing everything it can to avoid eating its vegetables when it would just be so much simpler to eat its vegetables.
So, Polly, what is Australia actually bringing to COP26? Is it bringing a long-term plan to get emissions down to zero? Has it announced anything yet?
Checked this morning and we still don't have a 2050 target.
And what about 2030? Will it increase its 2030 target given we're in the decisive decade? And what about fossil fuels? Will it stop opening up new coal mines, new gas fields?
Well, this week, Prime Minister Scott Morrison said fairly definitively, we will keep mining. So I don't think so.
And it won't even stop financing overseas coal projects either, which the G7 agreed to. So what the government is actually bringing to the table is the same old plan that it had in 2014 ahead of the Paris Agreement, which is the ultimate agreement when it comes to climate change and how we address it. And what that plan is, which is encapsulated in its nationally determined contribution, which it resubmitted in December, kind of like putting in some old homework and hoping that that will tick the box for a new assignment. It is to reduce emissions by 26 to 28% off a 2005 baseline by 2030, right? It's not an ambitious target, and we went through this last episode. If you compare it to the US or UK or Japan or the EU, they're all reducing emissions a lot more this coming decade compared to Australia. Now, based off this weak target, is Australia on track to meet it? Kind of. The Australian government says that it has already reduced emissions 20%. Now, we have a whole video that explains this over here, which you can watch, and we'll quickly touch upon it now. The way it has done that is quite creative. It has used a high emissions baseline. It has included things that are a bit dodgy as well, but it is all nominally legal, just not necessarily moral, just not necessarily the right way to do things. And other countries have said we don't do it like that because that would be too easy or that wouldn't be right. But the Australian government has insisted that's how it wants to do it. A good analogy is basically like a multinational corporation that is trying to reduce the amount of tax it pays. It can use its offshore bank accounts and tax havens. It can use A-grade accountants. It can do everything it possibly can apart from doing the right thing, which is paying its fair share. And that's kind of what the Australian government has done around emissions. So instead of having tax accounts, it has emissions accountants, and it has reduced that liability.
When the government says Australia's reduced its emissions, it actually means emissions in the land sector. We've got a whole video about this. But essentially, land clearing stopped in Queensland, and that had nothing to do with federal government climate policy. The government's taking credit for things that essentially were entirely outside of its control. However, in response to the government releasing its latest emissions figures, Minister Angus Taylor for emissions reduction said, clearly our comprehensive suite of emissions reduction policies are working. What he neglected to say was that emissions from all sectors of the economy that rely on fossil fuels are actually increasing. Like even the energy sector that's experiencing huge growth in renewables are not seeing the wins it should because emissions in other areas are going up. Our good friend Matt Canavan is the first to admit this. If you take away the things that are outside of our control, if you take away the wins in the land sector, our emissions are actually increasing. Now we're going to look at the policies and measures that the government reckons are going to get us the rest of the way to meeting and, more importantly, beating our target. Just a bit of background. Last year, the Australian government released something called the Low Emissions Technology Roadmap, which basically identified 5 key low emissions, not no emissions technologies. There's a lot of wiggle room in that word low. It reckons is going to get Australia all the way to meeting and beating its targets. Like, never mind the fact that we've actually already got those technologies in Australia. They're called the sun and the wind. It's identified apparently 5 key magical technologies that are going to help us meet our climate targets.
Thanks to some freedom of information digging from the Australia Institute, we found out that the way that the government landed on these 5 technologies that are the crucial pathway to meeting its goal wasn't from deep authoritative analysis around the emissions possibilities of reducing emissions from these different technologies. They were basically thought bubbles, indicative, just guesswork from the department around how much emissions reductions could come from each technology. And so 5 were picked not really because they were guns at reducing emissions or because they'd proven themselves, simply because the government liked these 5 technologies. And when they were further challenged around how much emissions reductions they would produce, they came up with some modeling, apparently, that showed that it would reduce emissions by 250 million tonnes per year by 2040. Firstly, why 2040? The Australian government doesn't have a target past 2030. Let alone 2040. And secondly, when the government was challenged on this in Senate estimates, they admitted that this target didn't actually include anything from the key technology being carbon capture and storage. Now that's important because carbon capture and storage has benefited from over $4 billion of federal and state government money, and there isn't a single fully operational commercial site in this country. And yet this crappy technology made the list of 5, and even then the government isn't banking on any emissions reductions from this technology for the next 20 years. This is the backbone of the government's plan to reduce its emissions. And on top of this, carbon capture and storage is being used to clean up another technology that the government is relying on, hydrogen. Now, quickly, you can make hydrogen 2 ways. You can make it in a zero emissions way by using renewable energy and water to electrolyze the water and create hydrogen. And then when you burn it, you get energy and water vapor, 0 emissions. Or you could get hydrogen from using fossil fuels, coal or gas, to turn it into hydrogen, and then burning that hydrogen, right? That entire process is so high polluting, you get more emissions from turning the fossil fuels into hydrogen than if you just burned the fossil fuels directly as an energy source. So the only way you could possibly clean up this really dirty process is if you promised to bury some of the emissions underground. Hence why carbon capture and storage is back in the equation. And so this is a major problem given that carbon capture hasn't worked, and yet it's also being used to back up another way of making a new energy source that could be just as high polluting if it fails, which it likely will. So Polly, given how crappy CCS, carbon capture and storage, has performed and how unlikely it will perform for hydrogen as well, Is there any real chance of these technologies being used to meet our emissions reduction target?
Well, they'll be used to meet our emissions reduction target. Whether they actually contribute to us meeting our emissions reduction target is another thing.
Well, they could contribute to it going up, emissions.
Yeah, that's true. They could contribute significantly to
Yeah.
it
So
going up.
they could be major contributors, really.
Yeah, yeah, it depends which way you look at it. So fossil fuel hydrogen and CCS are really just a way of keeping fossil fuels on life support in Australia. But we're taking them to COP as our very own special climate solution to get our emissions down and to meet our target. But beyond that, we're also enlisting other countries in using these technologies too. So in April this year, Scott Morrison and Angus Taylor issued a joint media release announcing these exciting new technology partnerships with other countries. We've got partnerships with Germany, Japan, Korea, Singapore, the US, and the UK. So all those partnerships, except Germany, include carbon capture and storage, fossil fuel-based hydrogen, and something called lower emissions LNG production.
Okay, lower emissions extraction and shipping out of a fossil fuel, that's the key problem when it comes to rising emissions.
Yeah, I believe this is what's being sold as carbon neutral LNG to other countries.
Yeah. I can't even get my head around that.
No, I'm not even going to bother. It's just,
Maybe it's like sugar-free Coca-Cola. I don't know.
if I do this, low emissions, that gets
Yep.
the message across.
I mean, it's the same thing as those high emissions, low efficiency coal
Yeah.
power stations that are just massively high polluting, just slightly better. But Polly, Germany, Japan, Korea, UK, US, they're all doing better than Australia. They've all increased their short-term targets. They've all taken a position against financing new coal projects. They're all looking at how they can scale up their clean energy to eventually transition to 100% clean energy. So they might be signing these tech partnerships with Australia, but they're not banking on that as the only way to actually reduce their emissions, are they?
They're not pinning all their hopes and dreams on carbon capture and storage. No.
No, because if you do that, then you will have broken dreams. Really, they're investing in the technologies that are actually proven to reduce emissions, like renewables or batteries or electric vehicles, or maybe keeping fossil fuels in the ground.
You know what they're doing, Richie? They're eating their vegetables. They're eating their broccoli.
There you go. These healthy, healthy countries. But don't worry, we can have some delicious fossil fuel-based hydrogen.
Right. So the sum total of what we're bringing to COP basically is sales techniques, old sales techniques, and greenwashing. We've got an unambitious target. We've got accounting that looks good on paper, but basically inflates our achievements. We've got partnerships for fossil fuel-based hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, both of which are Trojan horses for further fossil fuel use. And I just want to contrast this or set this against a backdrop of everything else that's happening in the world. We've just had an IPCC report that basically signals a code red for humanity and singles out fossil fuels as the #1 cause of climate change. We've had the UN explicitly asking Australia to phase out coal, saying that our economy is basically going to be destroyed if we don't. We've had the IEA report earlier in the year warning that government targets currently fall well short of what's required to keep us in line with 1.5 degrees of warming. We've had other countries, notably the US and the UK, calling us out by name and saying we are not doing enough on climate. No matter which way you look at it, we are falling well short of the expectations of the rest of the world and what's required at COP. Great job, Angus. Well done. So, Richie, what should we be doing?
It's a good question. Here's a few ideas. One, let's get to 100% renewable energy, and let's do so by this decade, what is called the decisive decade. We have the technology. We know that we have to retire our coal-fired power station clunkers. So let's make that happen now and come up with a clear pathway to do that in 9 years. Let's drop emissions by 3/4 this decade as well. Let's massively increase our weak and unambitious target. That will put us in line with net zero far sooner than 2050. Let's stop relying on land use changes or droughts or pandemics to reduce our emissions, and let's actually shift to clean energy. And not just cleaning and going to renewables for our electricity, but doing the same thing in transport as well. Doing the same thing in industry. Doing the same thing in numerous other ways by electrifying everything. Let's electrify our homes, let's electrify our cars, let's electrify our factories. And of course, we need to stop cutting down trees and plant more trees. All these options are available to us. The technology is already there. We don't need these new roadmaps. We just need the political will to actually step up and eat our vegetables.
Eat your veggies, kids. Thank you so much for watching. We would love it if you subscribed to the Australia Institute TV on YouTube. And we'd love it if you joined us for our next episode on Good Cop, Bad Cop, where we look at the way Australian policy has been completely captured by fossil fuel lobby groups.